All right. Today I decided to just pick the first four species of the day that I had. So here we have a random assortment. We start with the southern rubber boa, native to the United States. Specifically, they commonly are found in Southern California. They're nocturnal, eating small mammals, birds, and lizards, not very dangerous to humans. Um, it is controversial whether this specific type, discovered in 2006, should be separate from other rubber boas. Can't say I'm an expert, but here's an example if you watch the video of a rubber boa. Got the beautiful blue streaked lory. These birds live in the Banda Sea Islands and eastern Indonesia. They like to eat fruit, insects, and nectar and can live to be 30 years old. I think they're very beautiful birds. Again, video for you to click. Quiet, please. We have the speckled Cape tortoise, the smallest little species of tortoise, 2.4 to 3.1 inches. You can see how small it is in that person's hand. Limited to three small areas. They're herbivores, eating different types of plants, and they are considered endangered. They're so shh. And next we have the bobcat. There's approximately 1 million left in the world. They have relatively stable populations. They mainly hunt rabbits, and they have large territories of approximately 30 square miles. Bobcats can have multiple dens in these larger spaces and live 10 to 12 years in the wild. And the link is on the bottom left hand corner. Thanks, Noah. So today we're going to talk about conservation planning, specifically what scientists look at or what conservationists look at when they're trying to design reserves and protected areas to protect wildlife and ecosystems. So generally the goal in planning for conservation is to identify, first of all, the priorities that you want to protect, make sure that they're maximizing the number of species and ecological systems in a protected area. You don't want to protect just literally one animal. You want to protect a interconnected system so that all of those species can live in harmony, and have the resources that they need and food trophic levels and all those things. So part of that means looking at the minimum amount of land area that needs to be protected in order for that to be successful. Um, when looking at reserves and protected areas, we talked about this a little bit last semester, but it's also important to define areas where humans are allowed to go or where humans are not, depending on what you're trying to protect. Those rules can be more or less strict. The goal is obviously long term conservation. You don't want to take an animal or animals that are endangered and just protect them until they're not endangered and then stop protecting them. It usually should include a long term goal for protection. And then make sure that whatever threats that the biodiversity was experiencing before the reserves does not continue with the new model. So that's going to be an important one. So typically, it's good to start by trying to protect one or more focal species, so that umbrella species. Remember, that means that if you're protecting all of the resources that that one species means, that in turn you are also protecting many other species in the ecosystem as well. Preserving biodiversity and the species richness, and then endemism, which basically means the species that are endemic or original to that area, that belong there, that naturally do well there, or are originally from there. And you want to make sure you maintain ecosystem processes, sometimes across large areas. So another thing we talked about last semester was the Everglades and the idea of, maybe I talked about that last year, sorry. But the Everglades, yeah, I did in AP. The Everglades is a really good example where the hydrology, the flow of water on the land of the Everglades really matters. And they did some protection of sugarcane at one point, which ended up trickling down and really protecting ecosystems as well by protecting the land needed for sugarcane growth. So really good stories there of how protecting certain conditions can really have an overarchingly positive or positive effect, because you're protecting for many other species in a certain trophic level. So, what are the limits of reserves? Many reserves are located on unprotected, productive lands. The lands that are good for farming, building, and humans having access to water and things like that are usually already taken by humans. So oftentimes the land that's left, especially on the outskirts of where humans are living, is less ideal for this purpose. So oftentimes the new reserves don't actually represent the biodiversity that you're trying to protect. Probably you're trying to protect the biodiversity that was taken over by humans in the more ideal land location. So we need to prioritize what is important to protect in the reserves, and find a way to make it happen despite social and political challenges. So when reserves are being formed or planned, you want to make sure that they are following the representativeness, the comprehensiveness, and the persistence for them to be successful. You need at least two to be considered such. So representativeness or comprehensiveness basically means that a full variety of biodiversity is represented on your reserve. Hopefully, you'd have all different levels of that trophic levels. That includes you have the right species, you have good opportunities for habitats, preferably multiple different habitats, so that there can be interaction of animals from one habitat to another, as would occur naturally, and all those sort of natural ecological processes. Persistence means that the purpose of a reserve is for long-term survival. As I mentioned before, you don't just want one generation of to survive. You want it to be self-sustaining and continue to be successful. So some reserve design issues. SLOS, which stands for single large or several small, is a big debate, and obviously it's limited by land that's available and political issues and villages that already exist and things like that. So, or towns. So a single large reserve is obviously preferred because it can contain a lot of different ecosystems in it. But sometimes you might only have smaller pieces of land. Is it worth it? Well, there's some advantages and disadvantages to both types. So, what scientists looked into was that in a larger area or a larger patch, there tends to be more species and more lower rates of extinction. So there's more flexibility in those systems. When there's more species, if one food source goes extinct, but you have five other sources, you're probably going to survive. So having that diversity in the number of species actually helps and makes the whole system more resilient. Large reserves also have a larger interior space, right? Because there's less edge. They can support higher trophic level species. Those top predators need a lot of animals, so larger areas can support larger numbers of the primary producers and the lower animals on the totem pole, trophic pole, which means that you can eventually get to a high apex predator being supported by that system. Large reserves tend to have more individual communities that can or can't interact, larger ecosystems, more variety of ecosystems, and um, poor dispersers, so they don't have to constantly be moving from one place to another. So here's a case study about reserve size done in Africa. You can see there are 6 different reserves that are marked here in black. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they did a count of large mammals. Again, they did a transect. They walked in lines, seeing what large mammals or evidence of large mammals that they saw. They looked at carnivores, primates, and ungulates, like things that eat grass, right? In those reserves. They estimated human populations around the reserves as well and looked into that. And they wanted to figure out if either the size of the reserve or the presence of humans affected which and how many different species could persist in each of these reserves. What they found was the rate of extinction goes down as the reserve size goes up. So our smaller reserve had a higher rate of extinction. As you go down, we had a smaller rate of extinction. They also found that the rate of extinction goes up as the human population increases. So this is as you go across the human population sort of surrounding that reserve increases, and we're seeing in general extinction rates go up. We see a outlier here being a little bit low, so there's somehow a different impact, slightly different impact there, but generally the trend is more people living near-ish a reserve, the higher the rate of extinction that can happen in that reserve. And then they broke it down into carnivores, the primates and the ungulates. And we can see that the carnivores had the most steep rate of extinction based on size. So the smaller it is, the less food supporting them um, than the other two. And we can see here the rate of extinction going down as the distance to the edge increases. So again, remember when it's a smaller size, even in the very center, the distance to the edge is less. And when the distance to the edge is less, we see right here, we see higher rates of extinction. And when the distance to the edge is greater, we see lower rates of extinction. So the other option was several small. Well, small reserves can actually preserve diversity better sometimes. When you look across a large landscape, species aren't always in the same place. So sometimes you have small isolated patches of native species that live somewhere. And this can be wildlife that lives off a certain sort of food source or water source that's in one location. So even if you have a huge reserve, if that species only lives in one location, it doesn't benefit necessarily from having a larger reserve. So those endemic species that are specific to a certain spot can actually be preserved quite well with small isolated patches of reserve. And so you can sometimes strategically do that if you find multiple hotspots of animals or species that you want to preserve. Multiple small ones might actually be the right system. It's when we're talking about larger wildlife or wildlife that takes that either migrates or has just a demand for a much larger territory, that obviously larger is going to be better. So they did some case studies on birds, and they found that small patches of reserve is actually really beneficial for bird conservation in Australia. So they looked at 83 different patches and looked at the different birds that were living there. And what they found was that 91% of the bird species were found in smaller reserve patches. So the birds actually did well being able to be in a reserve and also get to the edge and get out and kind of come back. And because they're able to fly in and out, they actually did perfectly fine with small areas that were safe for nesting and living. And then with that flexibility, obviously, for them to travel outside of that range. So the debate, single large or several small? Well, it depends on what you're trying to protect. If you want species richness, if you want tons and tons of different species, obviously larger is going to make that more doable. If you want a rare endemic species that you really are just targeting, those salamanders that live in that stream, then you need to protect that stream. So you can get specific. Again, for specific diversity, small hotspots can work. If you find an area where something specific lives, you can just protect that. If you're looking for ecological systems and processes, that can go either way. It depends on what type of system you're trying to protect. So one is not better than the other, and some of them can serve the same purpose, and sometimes large is better, sometimes smaller is better. So when you're looking at a reserve, you want to look at complementarity, which is basically the number of species or whatever you're trying to protect that a new reserve adds. So you look at it and you say, well, how does the new reserve complement what we had before? How many of those species is it protecting? So is it only protecting one new species? Because here we've got D, A, C, and M protected. Here we have species A, M, and O. So this one's only protecting one new one. Or what if you put a new reserve down here? This one's actually protecting two new ones. So you can kind of choose your location based on wanting to add protections for more species if that's the goal. We added this third one here. You can see there's no new species protected. Is that where resources and energy should go? Potentially not. Now, if you're having a trouble with genetic diversity and you want some more individuals to be successful with the hope that they can travel and intermingle, maybe it's a good option. Shape. Does shape matter? We know that it does. Circular is very ideal to minimize the edge effect. Irregular borders, like you see in picture 2, means a whole lot of edge, which means that species that want to be protected from that edge, from whatever is kind of encroaching into the habitat, aren't going to be near those edges, which creates a lot more edge and a lot less center space. If you're looking at a species that migrates, especially land migrations, sometimes an oblong or oval shape might actually be a better option. Another thing to consider when we're looking at reserve shapes is elevation or land cover or forest cover or ground cover or whatever those species need. Does the shape that you're picking actually have that? If an oval shape has more of the habitat that an animal needs than a round shape, then obviously an oval shape would be the better option. So that needs to be considered as well when designing reserves. So in general, these are some images that we're going to go through to look at different ideas between reserve design. So here is basically showing this blue line is trying to show like a region or maybe like a river that an animal requires. Generally, it's going to be better if your reserve contains that stream or river than if only part of that is contained. For size, obviously, a bigger reserve can be better generally than a smaller one, unless you're just trying to hotspot and protect one specific species. Because more size means more ecosystem, more interaction, more animals, more land mass, all those things. Fragmentation, not as good as a whole reserve. If you're going to have lots of small ones, 3 is probably better than 2. You probably get some redundancy and also some new animals protected. Connectivity corridors, excellent if it's possible. So if you have to have fragmented habitat, if you can have a sort of connection where the animals can safely travel, that is ideal. If you can't have a corridor, the next ideal thing is a stepping stone. So like a small little protected area between 2 larger areas kind of acts as that. Habitat diversity for sure is great. So here, this light green circle represents sort of the reserve, with the idea that this might be a very different habitat than this one, which is a different one than this one. So we can have all different types of relationships and systems going there. And then shape due to edge. If we're not a migrating animal, a round shape is probably better than a long shape. If we're talking about an animal that would migrate through a path, this could potentially be better. So hence the terms generally better and generally worse. So the Biosphere Reserve model was founded in 1945 with a goal of trying to provide a model for local communities to protect land and animals that live in them and try to have a peaceful sort of goal of using scientific knowledge and cooperation with local people and governments to try to have an easy system to implement to protect biodiversity and in reserve building. So the idea of using science to provide peaceful solutions that also would benefit the people. And so we mentioned this last semester in that reserves are hard in areas where people are just subsistence living. When they are using the land to survive, it's hard to walk in and say, oh, no, this land is a habitat for an animal that needs to be protected, so you can't go there. That's an unrealistic ask from people who are barely surviving off the land as it is. So this model helps or attempts sometimes to provide a situation that works for everybody. So the Biosphere Reserve model basically says that we want to do 3 things. We want to conserve the landscapes, the ecosystems, the species, and the genetic variation. We want to develop economic and human resources. Culture is important, and make sure we're being ecologically sustainable. And logistically, we want to provide support for research, monitoring, education, and information. And in exchange, the support local, national, and global issues of conservation at the same time. So with the Biosphere Reserve model, this is an image that represents it. The idea is that there's a core, this purple area right here. There's no humans allowed. The animals and wildlife that live there are completely unbothered. If they're in this region, no one bothers them. There's the buffer, and that's where there's going to be some human presence allowed, maybe for education, training, research, tourism. Maybe if we're talking about an area where people are living subsistently off the land, maybe some hunting and gathering of local people is allowed in that sort of second circle. And then the transition area is where there's less restrictions, there's research, there's tourism, there's hikers, all kinds of things. So the human settlements that are in this sort of center circle are going to be mainly for the local people or potentially for a research station or education and things like that. The M in the circle in the center, which was the no human section, is just like some type of device or whatever for monitoring population numbers in there. One case study where something similar was done was in the Wulong Biosphere Reserve in China. They took about 200,000 hectares. Can't remember. I want to say it's like 100,000 acres. It was home to about 150 or more giant pandas. Again, the giant pandas being the umbrella species. That means if they protect the giant pandas require a lot in order for them to be living in an ecosystem that's healthy. So all those other animals and plants that are part of that sort of requirement for healthy panda ecosystem would be protected as well. And again, remember, to be an umbrella species, you have to be a species over a lot of land, which means a lot of other things get protected when they protect the land that you require. Other things that were protected under this included the red panda, the snow leopard, the clouded leopard, black bear, goral, porcupine, Tibetan macaw, and 5,000 or more species of plants living in this population underneath what the scientists determined that pandas need. So they did a lot of encouragement of ecotourism instead of forestry. Local people had been cutting down trees in this area, and so they tried to get them to make money through ecotourism instead, to reduce the habitat loss for pandas, to help ensure that pandas continue to access resources and reproduce. And they also combined this with some captive breeding programs to help the population. If you've never watched videos of these little pandas, it's worth your time. They are so cute. So ecotourism, as we've mentioned before, encourages the locals to preserve their natural environment because it is a source of revenue, and it makes them look at it as an important thing to keep safe in that regard. But ecotourism also can cause too many tourists to come. So it's important to find that balance, because too many tourists can actually threaten the thing that you're trying to protect. We all know that to get tourists in somewhere, you need to transport them and house them, and they'll eat food and use energy, and they produce trash and waste. And if they interact with their ecological target, panda bears, too much, it can actually change their behavior and things like that. So we know that you have to find that balance. And unfortunately, when you looked at all the different groups that were motivated to make this happen, there was a lot of different perspectives. The rural residents are the ones stuck with actually doing the conservation efforts. The more local people have to do the hard work. The stakeholders that are outside the reserve area enjoy the most economic benefits. So the people kind of living on the edges of, the towns on the edges actually do very well. Outside investors come in and they want to just make a profit. They're going to look for the cheapest goods that they can make the most money. They won't necessarily want to shop locally. They might have workers. They might bring workers in instead of hiring locally. So it's important to make sure that the local people are benefiting this for the success of it. So the last thing to consider is that traditional reserve designs sometimes are planned just assuming everything's going to stay the same. Well, especially today, especially in our current situation with climate change happening, if we set aside protected areas, one thing to consider now, which is a new consideration, is will the species continue to do well in those areas? Will their natural range need to shift because of climate change? If they migrate, might they migrate different paths or farther north or farther south? And when they travel outside the protected area, what's out there? Is it human populations right away, and it prevents them from having that flexibility? If so, having that conservation area right next to human population can literally protect the animals until weather and conditions and climate causes them to no longer be protected because that wasn't the land that they needed to adjust to. An example is wildebeest. You've probably all seen African documentaries of the wildebeest annual migration. They follow seasonal grazing and water patterns. They're one of the largest groups of land mammals in Kenya and Tanzania, and they travel. And so here are pictures of a bunch of different reserves. We got a reserve here, a national park, a conservation area. These are some ranchers, so these are farmers, right? We got a national reserve, a game reserve, and another game reserve. So these red areas are the areas where farmers are, and they aren't going to want to give up their land and resources to the wildebeest. And so the wildebeest, they wanted to look at their movement and how do their movements relate to where they're living in an area that's sort of considered protected. And for the most part, these are all little dots represent different wildebeest locations that were fitted with GPS. So you can see different kind of migratory patterns happening here. And if you pair it next to where the farmers are living and things like that, for the most part, this area right here, the farmer area, isn't impacted, but obviously some farmers would disagree with you. We also have this one right smack in the middle of a migratory path. But what nobody disagreed with was that generally, with the dry season and the wet season, um, for instance, right here, wildebeest spend their dry season up in Kenya. They cross into Tanzania for their during the wet season, and they're constantly cycling back and forth. Well, this migration is very important, especially as the government was considering a road to get from Musoma to Arusha, which are two big cities in Tanzania. Notice that it would cross directly across the wildebeest migration path. Well, you can imagine if it's the largest land animal migration that happens on our earth and there is a highway going across it, there's going to be some conflict. So, in the end, they actually chose not to build a road. They were aware of this migration and they chose differently. And I believe they went around, down and around to avoid that conflict because they're such an important animal. Another example is orangutans. They're endangered due to habitat loss and fragmentation, mainly from illegal logging and also from converting land into palm plantations for palm oil. Some have been lost to the pet trade and hunting or other types of persecution. So for this study, scientists did a bunch of aerial transects, so flying airplanes or helicopters in vertical lines to try to count numbers. They did low ground surveys. All the red dots represent ground surveys. These dotted ones, right over, kind of in this coloring, are the protected areas. The darker ones along the edges here, these are mangrove forests. Major rivers are marked with the blue lines. Non-forested areas are white, and the green, which is a good chunk of this picture, are commercial forest reserves. So these are areas of forest owned for commercial purposes of logging and cutting forests down. So you could see that they did studying in a lot of those commercial areas as well as the protected areas were well studied. Some of the mangroves as well. And so the gray, light gray, is the areas, the forest without orangutans. The light yellow up in this range here had less than 100 individuals. This darker yellowish mustard had 100 to 500. Lighter green, 500 to 1,500 individuals. And these darker greens are areas with over 1,500 individual orangutans. And so when you look at them next to each other, there were about 4,000 orangutans, and only 40% of them lived in the protected forests. The other 60% were living in the commercial forests marked in these areas. So that's really important for trying to figure out how to protect an animal. You can't tell the commercial companies, you can't own those forests anymore, but they needed to find a solution. How could the orangutans still live in those forests while the commercial companies were managing them? And the commercial companies are no longer just going in and clear cutting. They're aware that that's not healthy for the forest and they own that land and they want those forests to regenerate so they can cut more. But sometimes they're still cutting for palm plantations, but other times they're trying to cut in a slightly more environmentally friendly way so that it stays healthy, soil stays rich, so that trees can grow again. So in the past, orangutans did the best in tall, old growth forests where a tree would die, it would fall over a river, and that would be the way that orangutans could pass. Well, as certain areas were cleared either for palm plantations or for new growth of younger trees, they didn't have the old trees falling and providing passageways anymore. One cool solution that they came up with was rope bridges. Rope bridges weren't very hard. Leave a couple trees, suspend some ropes over the rivers, and then the orangutans can still live in the community, do okay, and they have a safe way of crossing those rivers. So instead of saying, "Hey, commercial companies, you can't cut down trees, you need to leave them laying over the river," they could say, "Hey, will you leave a couple and put a rope bridge across?" And it served that same purpose. So it's a great example of just an easy, not asking too much of the commercial companies, but allowing protection to go in for orangutans. So another unique option that worked out pretty well. So that was it for today. I hope you are all doing well, and we only have a few lectures left. I miss you guys.